I grew up at a time that was the peak for the HIV/AIDS epidemic in Southern Africa. By the time that I was 13, I'd lost two of my best friends, my favorite uncle, and about 20 members of our small community. So you can imagine the level of passion and enthusiasm with which I agreed when an alumnus of the Kennedy School, 35 years out of graduation, called us up and said, I have a problem. On graduating, I've risen very high in my organization. I'm in global health, and we're dealing with a rising epidemic in Southern Africa. We thought we'd handled HIV and AIDS, but we're actually seeing that the numbers are on the rise. Can you help? He said, this looks awfully a lot like something I studied at the Kennedy School. Is this an adaptive challenge? And it was problematic because when they disaggregated the data, they found that particularly for one subgroup, which isn't surprising because it's also the most vulnerable group, which is adolescent girls and young women, what they found is that although the numbers were stagnating, for this particular subgroup, the HIV infection rates were actually on the rise. And they'd thrown billions of dollars, the best of their expertise at the challenge, and still they saw no results. And the presenting problem seemed really familiar to me, because after a career working as a lawyer, drafting really wonderful, very tightly knit legislation, instruction sets that didn't lead to anything, after many years as a management consultant, advising ministers, community leaders, CEOs of corporate organizations, I'd seen a lot of this pattern, where we throw a lot of money and a lot of expertise at a challenge, and we still see no progress. But for this particular alum, let's call him M, he asked us for a balcony moment. He said, can we get on the balcony? What else is going on here? What am I missing? Now, as many of you probably know, we spent 40 years at the Kennedy School answering the question of what are we missing? Every year, we have over 1,000 students come through our doors, like yourselves. And every year, a subset of those students sits down with us and we collectively look at their challenges. And we ask, when was a time that you tried to exercise leadership and you failed? And we ask the question, what did we miss? And from that 40 years, those 4 decades of looking at leadership failures, we've basically created, or has produced, a framework for understanding why it is that people with the best intentions aren't able to exercise leadership. A robust, practical, living, breathing framework. And today, I want to share just 2 ideas with you. The first big insight, or the first big idea, is that what we've seen in 40 years of looking at leadership failures is that the most common mistake that people tend to make in the work of leadership, the biggest waste of time and resources, is caused by diagnostic failure. People get the diagnosis of the problem wrong, and because they do a poor diagnosis, they also apply the wrong solutions. There's 2 main reasons that this happens. One of them is personal, and the other is practical. It's personal in that no one in this room does not enjoy the joy of being able to solve people's problems for them. So there's a personal pride in solving people's problems, in reaching for the closest solution, in reaching for something that worked before. And it's political because whenever there is a problem, and whenever there is a crisis, people turn to you. And they say, we elected you, we promoted you, we nominated you, you fix it. So what we do is we reach for what we know, and we don't slow down to understand what really is the nature of this problem. So what we've seen is that people tend to treat a whole world of challenges that might more appropriately be described as adaptive, that require discovery, as if they were technical in nature and prone to expertise. So let me just do a bit of a double click. So on the left-hand side are these technical problems. When something is technical, the problem is clear, the solution is clear, the primary locus of work is with an expert, and the things that you need mostly are just really a function of time and money. There's a whole host of really important challenges that are technical, critical, big challenges in the world. So if I wanted to build a bridge from this side of the river across the road to Harvard Business School, that's a technical challenge. I can figure out how many men, women, tons of steel and concrete do I need. I can predict to the day how long it's going to take to build that bridge. At the same time, if a child is playing outside at JFK Park and they fall over and they break their arm, it's a straight line analysis from the moment that that child falls, break, hospital, x-ray, doctor, painkiller, cast, home, and we can predict to the day how long it's going to take until they're back on the monkey bars. All kinds of problems that are technical. The basic mode of operation is you have a problem, I take the problem off your shoulders, I prescribe the solution, I fix it for you, I give the problem back to you, now fixed, here's your child, here's your bridge, all solved. So that's one side of it. On the other side of it, though, and as I say this, I recognize that it's overly simplistic, because nothing in the world is really ever just black or white, awful lot of gray in the world. There are these challenges that we might describe as adaptive. When a challenge is adaptive, the problem tends not to be clear. It tends not to be clear, perhaps because it's something that we haven't seen before, or it tends not to be clear because we can't even align on the fact that there is a problem. I mean, is climate change real? We tend not to have a clear sense of the problem because sometimes someone's holding a piece of the nose, someone's holding the tail, someone's holding a leg, and we can't even agree on the fact that what we're looking at is an elephant. Because the problem's not clear, the solution also is not clear. What tends to happen is we throw something at the problem persists, it recurs. We throw a solution at the problem, and nothing shifts, nothing moves. If you can't make that progress on the challenge, it's usually an indicator of the fact that it's a problem that's adaptive. Or you chop one head off, but it's a hydra, and there's 7 other heads running around in the water, so we don't see any progress. But also, when a challenge is adaptive, the work doesn't just sit with the authorities. You can't take an adaptive challenge off people's shoulders. The people with the problem tend to be the problem, but they're also the solution. And in fact, the more adaptive a problem becomes, the more that work tends to sit with the people who have the problem. And I used to have to spend a lot of words explaining what an adaptive challenge was, but then we all lived through COVID, and we all got a sense of what it feels like to live an adaptive challenge, what it feels like to work our way through it, to learn, to unlearn, to experiment, to succeed, to fail. And now I think that's become tangible to many of us. But the main resource that you need in working adaptive challenges are not just a function of time and money, because the work also sits in the hearts and in the minds, and the loyalties, the relationships, the deeply held values of the people with the problem. And in saying this, just focusing on that last bottom bit, when you try to change people's hearts, trying to change their minds, trying to change who they think that they are in the world, their sense of what value even means, what's my identity, you're essentially messing with their DNA. And we use the word adaptive because we like to borrow from nature. Because in nature, that process of adaptation really consists of 3 main functions. Trying to figure out, what do we keep? What do we let go of? And where do we need to innovate? Because in order for a caterpillar to turn into a butterfly, or for a creature to grow the webbed feet that it needs to survive rising waters, some evolution, some shift in that DNA needs to happen. And I know we're at a school of government, and I know we don't like to disappoint, and I know we don't like to let people down. Those trade-offs are going to be essential. Because doing the same thing the same way you've always done it and avoiding that lost piece is going to get you exactly the same results that you've always gotten. So in the work of adaptive work, you're necessarily going to have to engage with that lost occasion. In the case of Zambia, they were treating it like it was a technical problem. They were treating it as a technical problem in that they were focusing really on just the experts. And it was like, it's a medical problem, the doctors can fix it. They didn't zoom out enough to understand who are the stakeholders, who's relevant to this. And they certainly didn't think about that lost piece. Because although there's girls, they have homes that they live in. There's men who are the same age that they're sleeping with, older than them, who they're sleeping with, and we're not having that conversation because it's taboo. There's a church and a clergy who preach abstinence in a country that's deemed itself to be Catholic, but where the current challenge is not jiving with prevailing trends. There's a government that sets the infrastructure, donors that dictate how it is that we approach this challenge. And most of the time, we go into these change equations with a wonderful solution of how things are going to be better. We don't understand why the system is functioning the way that it's functioning. There's no such thing as a broken system. So you can bring all the ideas in the world. You can bring the most brilliant economic health analysis in the world, but unless you can understand why the system is functioning the way that it's functioning and what's at stake for people, the likelihood is that you'll continue to get the same results that you've always gotten. What does it mean to have a parent have a child with a conversation with their child about sex? I don't know how many of your parents ever were able to have this conversation with you other than in, the birds and the bees. What does it mean for a government that has an election coming up to admit that they've lost it and they don't know what they're doing? And that actually, even though we have these values, even though this is who we say we are, you're going to have to need to do some of that work. We're going to have to change our identity as the people of Zambia. What does it mean for a donor who's used to being in control to lose that control, to cede power over to experimentation and to failure, even if that's what it is that's going to move the work forward. So the first big thing is that we don't do enough of that diagnosis. And if you were able to do that diagnosis, if you were able to understand what's at stake, then perhaps you could craft a much more productive strategy. Perhaps you could pace the work and figure out, can I move quickly according to my timetable? Or is it going to require me to move more slowly because it's going to take more time for people to get on board? Perhaps you could sequence the work. We want to do this work in straight lines, go straight up the staircase, but perhaps there's a couple of detours that you need to make. Perhaps there's a couple of quick wins that you can lock down to create more space, more buy-in for the thing that you want to do. Perhaps there's some cushioning that you can do. As people accept that loss, perhaps it's training or teaching or having someone come on board. Or perhaps that work is actually giving people a set of incentives that will require them to get on board. Or sometimes it's accepting casualties. Because sometimes doing that work, I just can't get on that ship because my grandmother's bones are buried here. But how you treat that person, how you manage that, is going to be something that other people are looking at. So the first big thing is that people don't do that diagnostic work. The second big thing that we found is that people don't lead. And before you point the finger up or down, and perhaps also as a way of unlocking your own sense of agency, when we talk about leadership, we talk about leadership as an activity. Leadership is about the work. And it tends to be about the work of disappointing people, but doing that at a rate that people can tolerate. Where the work is technical, where we know the answer, where we know the path, there's no need for leadership. Leadership really is only relevant if the problem is adaptive. But a lot of the time, people don't engage in that work because it can be dangerous. It can make you really unpopular. It can be uncomfortable. The word leadership comes from the word leaf. It means to go forth and die. In ancient times, the leaf used to be the person who used to go out and battle on that first horse, waving their flag, showing the rest of the army which way to go. And of course, they often would be the person that gets taken out. But this is what it means to be a pioneer. This is what it means to be an entrepreneur. This is what it means to disrupt. This is what it means to innovate. It means you're pushing people over that line. And I don't know about you, but I've had a lot of situations where I'm sitting in a meeting and I'm functioning according to someone else's version of why we're here. I'm functioning according to someone else's version of what we're doing, when we're going to do it by, and how we're going to do it. And it may be that I'm closer to the action and I can see that actually what we need is something else. But instead, I stay stuck in my role, and I say stuck in those expectations, rather than recognizing that the work of leadership actually lies on the other side of this line. Because everything inside that line is the status quo. Everything inside that line is what people expect that will give us the same results we've always seen. But innovation, growth, change, disruption, adaptation lies on the other side of that line. And so right now, as I think about the Pope, as he's trying to reform the Catholic Church, a lot of the work that he's doing, it's outside that line. It's not a fun job. He's disappointing his own people and trying to do that at a rate that people can tolerate. In France, Macron is raising the age of retirement because the money's running out and people are living longer. That's adaptive work that needs to be done, but that's also going to be on the other side of that line. So if you're going to do this work, how do you think about it? How do we increase your chances of survival? History is littered with people who've exercised leadership, sometimes from positions of authority, sometimes without any authority. In some cases, they've done it and lived to celebrate the day. In some cases, they've paid with their lives. So how do we take this work seriously? And how do we think about what is your placement in a system? How do you build the partnerships and the alliances that you need to get the work done? What do you need to generate other leadership? Because the myth of the sole lone warrior of leadership is not leadership. How do you manage the disequilibrium that's going to come at you as you distribute this loss? And we don't have time for this right now, but how do you take care of yourself? Because sometimes people end up at the Kennedy School because they haven't done that well enough. But you can't be an agent of change unless you can also take care of yourself. Thank you.